Exciting news, you guys. We are getting ready to have our 100th episode, which means that we are doing a giveaway.
Yay! Yay!
I'm going to tell you what you could win and how you can enter, and then you can reach out to us. So you could be the grand prize winner of Church History in Plain Language book and workbook. That's a classic from Bruce Shelley. There's also the Schuyler Quintel ESV Bible in camel calfskin worth $255. What?
One of the most beautiful Bibles I've ever seen. Whoever wins this, I'm so jealous.
Beautiful Bible, amazing Bible, greatest Bible.
There's also a complete map set from Biblical Backgrounds. This is going to walk you through all of the journeys that you see, I think, in the whole Bible.
Yeah, so this is their complete set. So from Abraham to Jesus to Paul's ministry, you get to trace those through the geographical maps that they give you. It's really great for learning and understanding where these biblical events actually took place.
And we're also giving away a 1-year subscription to Biblingo. That is a really cool biblical languages app where you can learn Hebrew and Greek, but biblical versions of those, so not modern versions. And I believe now they've partnered with SEU for college credit for language. So that's really cool if you're a theology student. Pretty sure that's transferable. We're also giving away a French Terry Logic of God hoodie and some stickers, as well as Bible highlighters and pens. And this is all worth about $798.
What?
If you would like to enter, you can go to our Instagram and follow the instructions there. But if you're like me and you don't like social media, then you can just go to our website and submit on the contact form, sharing one of the questions that maybe you've never heard a satisfying answer to in church. It could be something that you've always wanted to ask, something that you have asked and have been disappointed with the answer you've gotten. And then we will do a little mini series with all of the questions we receive. And we've already received 5 questions. So I'm pretty excited about that. So if you have any questions, reach out to us, but we would love to give you the opportunity to sign up. And the giveaway does close on May 31st. So if you're listening to this, it's because the giveaway is still happening. So join us.
Hi, thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome.
Haley, I just want to thank you for your thoughtful question. Is poop dollar biblical?
A what?
Poop dollar.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Is that what you wanted?
Yes, it is.
Before you answer this.
So Haley is my sister-in-law. She's Cody's sister-in-law as well. She's married to Cody's brother. And she is a very profound thinker. No, it's an inside joke, okay? But I had to answer it because it was sent in as an official question.
Them's the rules.
Even though she's disqualified from entering legally because she's family.
No, she can't win. Sorry, Haley.
Our bad.
You will not be put into the randomizer for a drawing. Sorry.
But, let's answer the question. Because it turns out that the Bible does talk about poop.
And dollars. Dollars.
Shekels.
So for me, the standout verse for answering this question is in Philippians 3:8, where St. Paul calls his former religious gains dung. And I think that is the biblical translation for poop dollar.
So whenever you invoke poop dollar, you're saying your previous gains are that of dung.
Yes. You're saying that you didn't earn it, and it is therefore a poop dollar.
Oh, okay.
Nobody wants to touch that.
Good to know.
But, some honorable mentions for waste-related Bible verses are in 1 Kings 18:27, where Elijah mocks Baal's prophet, saying, maybe your God is relieving himself. So honorable mention there. Doesn't talk about dollars, though, so doesn't count. Also, in Ezekiel 4:12-15, where God tells Ezekiel to cook food over human excrement as a prophetic sign symbolizing how defiled Israel became in exile.
Ew.
So there's that. Need I say more? I don't know. Those are the top three.
I bet this isn't what you were expecting you were going to hear today.
We needed to break up the seriousness. I came prepared with the poopy prophets, something like that. I don't know. I'll make it a sticker.
What is the Bible verse about the garments of poo?
Oh, bother.
I don't know. Garments of poop?
It's one of the prophets. I can't remember which.
So Zechariah, potentially? Joshua, the high priest, wearing filthy garments?
Yeah.
Poopy garments.
The word there, if you look at the translation, it shouldn't be filthy. It should be dung covered.
Now Joshua was standing before the angel clothed with filthy garments, and the angel said, remove the filthy garments from him. And it actually is Sa'ah in Hebrew, which means human waste.
Wait, which prophet was this?
This is in Zechariah, and they're talking about Joshua, the high priest. Joshua is representing Israel, and he is so defiled by sin that he is metaphorically wearing poop-stained clothes.
Oh, Joshua, what are you wearing? Take those off. Oh.
And God replaces them with clean garments, symbolizing cleansing and justification.
Yeah. When we get to that one in our history, there's a lot of symbolic remove your filth, put on clean garment. A lot of good stuff there.
Are we ever going to get to that?
Poop dollar.
So that is the biblical interpretation of poop dollar.
If you ever hear it, you'll know what it's referencing. Not that we usually say it on the podcast, but
If ever. I don't think we've ever said it.
This is the first and probably only time of saying it on the podcast, but maybe not. It can be a callback now.
Thanks, fam. Well, it's like there's like a lot of heavy conversation that happens on the podcast. It's hard to make it playful sometimes, but we're not this like prudish, uptight group of people. We like to laugh, and it made me laugh. And so I included it in our outline.
It's good. There's a time for laughter and there's a time for sadness.
And on that note.
Aw, buddy.
Hey, buddy. So, Buddy didn't initially send this question to us as part of our 100th episode spectacular, or whatever we want to call this. He actually just sent this as a legitimate question. And he did this shortly after our shout out to him on one of our previous episodes not that long ago. And we thought that it was such a good question that we really needed to do a full in-depth response, because replying back and forth on a Facebook Messenger is really not a great way to explore these deeper questions. And also it's a question that a lot of people, both Christians and atheists and agnostics and just people with questions, struggle with. Like, we all struggle with this one. So his message in its entirety, and I know it's a little long, but it's worth reading. I know you covered God is good, but it doesn't quite satisfy me. I know you guys like Job, but I in no way see a good or just God in that story. Like, if you heard a similar story where parents let someone hurt their children the way God let the devil do everything to Job, you would want the parents of that child arrested or worse. But also just in the creation story of God making humanity. If he is outside of time, and he knew we would fall short before he even started, that doesn't seem loving. Like, I imagine if you had children knowing they will never be good enough to sit at your house, I'd say you were a horrible person. And when those children fall short, as they are guaranteed to do, they deserve eternal death. It doesn't seem like there's any love from God. Why even create us if we are literally built to fail?
Wow. That one hits home, because it is something that, like you said, Ben, like everybody needs or has come to this question. Like, it's the problem of, is God good? Is, the problem of good and evil. Like, this is kind of still at the main heart of the atheist Christian debate on, is there a God?
And it was posited hundreds of years ago and has still not received a fully satisfying answer. And we'll get into that. But I want you to know, buddy, this is a question we all struggle with. It's not wrong to struggle with it, and it's good to struggle with it, because there is meaning in that struggle. But I do think that far too often there are people who will just tell you, because they don't have a satisfying answer, you just have to believe. In fact, that's an answer that you get for many questions you ask.
Almost all of them in my experience.
How many? Like, I remember when we were newlyweds, Cody and I went and talked to a pastor about some of the questions that he had had. And Job was one of the questions that Cody asked about. And the pastor sat there for a second and just like looked at you. And I think he was crapping himself trying to figure out how to respond because it was deep and hard. And he probably didn't get asked those questions very often. And then he just was like, son, you just got to believe that God loves you and has what's best for you. And, sometimes faith fills in those gaps and you never really get a satisfying answer and you just got to believe. And we went home and you were like, I told you so.
Yeah, this was before we went in there. I told her word for word what he was going to say, and he proceeded to say word for word what I told her he was going to say.
Yeah.
Because this wasn't the first time I had talked to a pastor about these difficult questions and voiced concerns with God's goodness myself. So this is very familiar to me.
I was panicking, thinking you were not a Christian anymore. And like, how could you doubt God's goodness? And it was scary. Like these questions, when you wrestle with them, they are terrifying. So Betty, thank you for sharing them first and foremost.
Moving on. No. Oh. We are going to answer this question. But before we did, we wanted to lay that out because this is very important. And it is frustrating for a lot of Christians to never really seemingly get any answer to this question, let alone a satisfying one.
So I think we all have different opinions on this question. And I know, Ben, you wrote a majority of this outline. For me, I still don't have a solid answer. Like I wrestle with this a lot personally, and I know how to organize my thoughts to keep God at the top and still in the position of good authority. But it is difficult for me to look at some of the stories in the Bible and see the suffering and know that God can intervene, but doesn't always. And today, living in a fallen world where babies are dying and children get cancer and, men and women are assaulted. And, there's just so many horrible, sad things. And statistically speaking, like we know now, suffering is completely universal. And it's guaranteed to us according to scripture being Christians, but it doesn't make it easy to swallow being in this world. Like it is painful to be here sometimes, a lot of the time. And I don't know that there is ever going to be a satisfying explanation knowing that a man and a woman ruined it all for us by sinning in the Garden of Eden. It's heavy.
It's very heavy. Answering this one satisfactory. I still haven't been able to answer all facets of this satisfactory for myself. There's certain areas where Ben and I have talked about this one a little bit more, I think, than you and I, but there's always another facet to this question that pops up that leaves out the satisfactory answer of completely removing our interpretation of God's goodness, imposing our view of goodness on God versus what his view of goodness is.
All right. So, buddy, I did put a lot of work into this particular question because there are actually a series of sub-questions inside of it. And I think we need to break your question as a whole down into individual parts. So, starting at the first, I in no way see a good or just God in that story, referring to Job's story. Like if you heard a similar story where parents let someone hurt their children, the way that God let the devil do everything to Job, you would want the parents of that child arrested or worse. I absolutely agree with you, 100%. If anyone were to do something to their own children like what happened to Job, killing your children, letting people die, absolutely. If you were to know a home invader was about to come into your home and you didn't stop it and that home invader comes in and kills your children, absolutely that's criminal negligence. And I think there isn't a soul alive that would disagree with that. Leaving that extreme aside for a moment, are there situations where you can do something to a child that would be considered evil for anyone else? As an example, punishing misbehavior. I was spanked as a child. If my parents had taken out a wooden spoon, bent them over, and started spanking them on the behind, if they did something they didn't like, that would be considered assault and battery, and they would have been thrown in prison. That didn't happen to me. I was a child, and what's more, I'm an innocent child. I don't know what I'm doing. So why is it that my parents were able to spank me but not spank any other adults? And in fact, they would be thrown into prison for spanking adults. And that's a legitimate question. Why? Why is it acceptable to attack a child? And you may say, well, I don't find it acceptable. I don't know you, buddy. I don't know your philosophy on parenting and spanking and whatnot. But let's say that we set that aside. I was also occasionally put in a corner for 30 minutes. Well, can you do that to an adult? Can you grab an adult if they're doing something you don't like and forcibly put them in a corner for 30 minutes? Basically abduct them and force them to stay there for those 30 minutes. And if they try to get up, you will force them back into that corner until they good and well learn their lesson, young man? No, you can't do that. Why can you do it to children? And again, children are more innocent. They don't know what's going on. So why are you able to do this to something that's more pure and innocent than an adult? You would think it would be the opposite. Context and purpose are important. In fact, authority and purpose are important. God has ultimate authority. I don't think anyone would argue that, atheist, Christian, otherwise. If God exists, he has ultimate authority because he created all things. He also has ultimate purpose. He's not just an exemplar of the virtues, he is the virtues. God is love, and every virtue comes from love. You can derive every moral law and every moral virtue from love. So because God is in such a high position, and he has ultimate authority and, more than that, responsibility, God is looking across the entire earth, and he has the ability to intervene at any given moment in any given person's story. Now, we get a snapshot of Job, and because it's a snapshot, it looks really bad. But take Job out of it, again, for a second, and look at humanity as a whole. We have billions of people on this earth. God has the ability to intervene in each individual person's story en masse and prevent bad things from happening. But what is the problem with doing that? There are certain virtues that require bad things to happen. For instance, can you forgive someone if no one ever transgresses? No. Can you perform justice if injustice never happens? No. Can you give mercy to someone if no one requires mercy? No. So there are certain things that we all recognize as good, as very high virtues, but that require bad things to happen. In the case of Job, the devil makes a very good point, and we emphasize this usually when we talk about Job, that if good things only ever happen to people who do good things, you will have selfish people do good things so that good things happen to them. Superficially, they are just righteous people. But internally, as a matter of the heart, which is what God cares about most, they're not real. It's not true. And so, as a result, good, kind, righteous people have to be tested in order to display their righteousness and make it true. Virtues don't exist unless they are exemplified. As an example, if I were to say, I have a friend here and he's the best cook in the world, absolutely incredible. I know for a fact that he is better than any other cook in the world. Your first question would be, okay, what's he made? And if I say nothing, I just know that he is. What good is that? How could I even say that he is the greatest cook in the world if he's never made anything? In the same way, how can God say that Job is a truly righteous man if he's only ever done good things because God has given him good things? It was shown that he had tons of children, tons of wealth. Obviously, he would praise God's name because God has given him all of this stuff. You don't bite the hand that feeds you. But what happens when all that is taken away? All you're left with is the virtue of righteousness itself. Is righteousness worth suffering for? And to you, buddy, I would pose that question. Do you believe that there are virtues in this world that are worth suffering for? Leaving God out of it for a second. Are there things in this world worth suffering for? Do you believe that as a questioning atheist or agnostic? Why do you believe that if yes? Because presumably that's inherent in your question. You're asking, how could God do this? How could a loving God do this? You have a high view of love, clearly, because you view it as a violation of love to allow these things to happen. Why is love important? Why is it good? Why does it matter? You didn't exist for an infinite amount of time before your birth. You won't exist for an infinite amount of time after your death. Why does it matter? That's something we all have to struggle with. Why does any of this matter? Our answer is that there is, from everlasting to everlasting, a God who exemplifies these eternal, immortal characteristics, these virtues that are higher than anything in the physical world. We as physical beings, as physical creatures, are capable of accessing this eternal concept. And by expressing these eternal concepts, we grow closer to the eternal God. We become more like him. And this very short life is ultimately building us, preparing us for the ultimate decision of joining eternally with those virtues, with God as the source of those virtues, or rejecting them. So, when you view Job's plight, but not just Job's plight, but all of our plights in that light, all we are doing is preparing to be joined with God or to reject him. That's the initial part of this question. And I'm sorry, I know that's a lot of words, and I don't even know if any of that is going to resonate with you, because not everyone is driven philosophically. But I hope that that helps in some way, because that's the way I approach this. But before we go any further, do you guys have anything to add to that?
I think you have to do some research on whether, kind of like our discussion on Genesis, do you believe the story of Job is literal, or do you believe that it is kind of like a poetic story that is more generic? Could apply to anybody kind of a thing. Like, was this just one dude a long, long time ago? We can't even really pinpoint when in history this happened, or is this like a life lesson proverb type story where we can gain wisdom about how God may have interacted with Satan during a certain time in the divine council? There's a lot of layers there that you have to figure out what you believe for yourself. And that kind of changes how you can interpret this differently. I have a really hard time with this question. And I have a hard time believing that Job is the only person that experienced total loss.
No, I think the whole point of Job's story is it's a snapshot, just a tiny snapshot into what God deals with for every individual person. All of us are Job. We're all going to go through points where God is looking down on us and something bad happens. And God has the power to stop it. Sometimes he does, but oftentimes he doesn't. And we're being shown in the story that there is an ultimate purpose for it. And no matter what, it doesn't seem loving, because you're right, Betty. No matter what, this isn't something that we would allow for our children. But there is a limited amount of suffering that we do directly impose or even allow on our children. And it's because there's a purpose for it, and we have the authority to do it. And that goes infinitely more for God. And you see this in everyday life. The more authority someone has, the more suffering and the more good in that suffering they can impose. For instance, there are drill sergeants in the military. If you're going in as a trainee into the military, there's a lot of suffering that's dished out on you, but it's with a very high purpose. If you're going into work, there are certain types of work, like I used to work as an industrial electrician. I suffered a lot in that job. I was forced to do a lot of work that was very painful, and that was dangerous. You have a job, and you have to do it. And if you're a person who's the foreman of that job, you are forcing people to suffer and to get hurt, to do something that is less valuable than a human life. But it's because you have an authority and a responsibility, and it's something that we all accept.
Yeah, and that's kind of the position that I view Job from. So like God's rebuttal in 38 of, like, where were you when, I was laying the foundations of the earth? And God has this big picture aspect, and we're just kind of, middle management at this point. Like, we get to see the larger picture over the animals and the birds and the shrubs, the trees, but we don't have a full scope of eternity like God. And being in upper management myself, I see how this authority plays out in the day-to-day. I've started at the bottom where I've been in the service, the boots on the ground type of mentality, and in executive leadership where you have to take the full scope of the company in and make business decisions that impact the entire company for the greater good rather than one individual business unit. So that's at play here too, is the greater good of humanity and the allowed suffering, like you just mentioned, in different aspects of life. Like some areas, depending on how you view suffering, but there's that I'm full of cliche sayings, but today, but like pressure produces diamonds. Like going through sports, I was very into basketball growing up, and lifting weights, and lifting to failure. That's one of the best ways, or at least at the time when I was doing it, that you could build muscle. Pushing yourself to failure in basketball was the best way to improve your skills. Playing well above your means. Like, I was in 8th grade playing with high schoolers. I was in high school playing with college level students. Like, putting yourself out of the comfort zone, putting yourself into making, like, it was embarrassing for me to play with college students when I was in high school. I got my butt kicked on the regular. I would consider that a form of suffering, whether, not in Job's sense here, but it was humiliating, just getting trashed all day. But I also never saw so much improvement in my basketball game than when I was doing that. Like, you level up to the experience level of the people surrounding you. So I think that's at play here. And then, we see different levels of authority play out as well with police officers. They might not necessarily hold to the same laws that regular citizens uphold to. They have some leeway there because in their duties, they have to do things that would not be the safest or best for humanity at that time, like speeding to get to somewhere. Like, everybody's probably had cops blow by them going well over the speed limit. That doesn't mean they're above authority. That means what they're getting to is usually very adamant that they get there faster to assess the situation and maybe protect it. They carry guns with them for lethal force at sometimes, and sometimes that decision leads to discharging that firearm. That decision for every cop that I know or have known is not an easy decision, but usually it's done for the betterment of the surrounding community and the betterment of humanity in that situation. Is it a good thing that it happened? Absolutely not. But there are some points where the suffering or evil in that moment produces a better outcome, if that makes sense. So that's one of the mentalities I take when reading Job and dealing with the issue of good and evil.
One of the things that I think of when I look at Job's story is just the fact that all of his children died. And like being a parent, thinking about how horrible it would be to lose one of our children and how horrible it was to lose 3 babies before they were born. And when Cody and I were in this certification for church leadership a couple of years ago, we had to take a couple of classes on grief and loss in the church and how to talk to people and resource people who had lost someone. And one of the questions that I asked in the class, because I have personal experience with it, is what do you say as a pastor to somebody who has lost a baby? And his response was, think about where your baby is now. And it was a really hurtful moment for me because, this pastor's asking me to kind of celebrate the fact that my dead baby is with Jesus. And that's really, really difficult, but it's also not wrong. So you have to sort of swallow some tough pills here because Job did lose everything, but a human life is a human life. And depending on, granted this is Old Testament, but depending on their beliefs and depending on what you believe doctrinally, that child or that person could have an eternal life that you would get to join them in someday. It's not easy to accept that.
Yeah, and this isn't just a, blanket, you just got to have faith type of thing, which some people would say, but trusting that God has the grander scheme of things, like the management for the entire company mentality. One of the most difficult times in our lives, Gina and I's, has been when we went through infertility and miscarriage after miscarriage, and knowing that we could get pregnant, but our child would die in utero and we'd have to deal with that. And that happened 3 times that we know about. And I don't know anybody who wouldn't consider that an evil. It's not a good thing, but at the end of that, we got to see how, because we are in a fallen world, and that's part of the world we live in our lifetime, we got to see how that could be used for good. Like, this was something that was terrible for us, but it is a very common experience across mankind and not something that is talked about or pushed into very much. And Gina and I got to come around people who were experiencing that as well. And it was something that was evil that was used for good.
You take your statistical experience, whatever it is, and you apply that to the way that you protectively treat others. And suddenly, somehow, you have an Acts church where evil and grief and suffering is pervasive. And yet, you have this culture and community that has embraced you and loved you through it. It's profound. And I think that's one of the lessons we learn from Job. It's not that we can somehow avoid suffering because it is truly universal. You just find the statistic you fall in for suffering and you use it to glorify God, and you use it to help other people, and you use it to protect other people.
Yeah, Friedrich Nietzsche once said that if you know the why, you can suffer anyhow. We as Christians don't always know the why. However, we know there is a why. We know there is a reason. We're just not told. That's the ultimate lesson in Job. There is a reason, an infinitely good reason, but you aren't always going to be told why. And while we do get the reason for why Job is tested, that ultimately righteousness has to be tested, we're not given the reason for why it had to be in the way that it was. Why Job had to lose all of his family. Why he had to be struck down with boils and sickness himself. And why he had to be surrounded by friends who kept telling him it was his fault when it wasn't.
I know that it's not the same to have more children after you've lost children. There's no such thing as a replacement child, okay? But Job suffered in every conceivable way, and his blessing was greater because of it. And I'm not saying that this is prosperity gospel stuff, okay? This is not that. What I'm saying is the greater that you suffer and the more that you glorify God in it, the way that Job did, while wrestling and questioning and crying out and being angry, the more God made sure he was whole at the end of it. And our promise as people living after Jesus ascended into heaven, our promise is that we will be made whole. There's going to be things we have to go through first, but eventually we will be made whole. We will be brought somewhere else that is perfect. We're just not there right now. And that's not a great feeling. And it's really, really difficult to get through. It was difficult for Job, but that's why we do it together.
Yeah, and I think there's this individualistic mentality, and I mean this with the most love and grace as possible, but like we think that it is unloving to have to struggle for anything as well. Like it is, if anything bad happens to us, then there can't be a loving God. If we're not absolutely just catered to and given what we want, then something must be off here. And there is, but through any kind of science that measures struggle or just experience that people have, like getting out of your comfort zone is one of the best ways to improve your body. It's one of the best ways to improve your mental state. It's one of the best ways to grow is getting out of your comfort zone and pushing yourself to suffering. So if that is God's goal here, then I would still say that's loving. If it produces growth and development and strength, I would still say suffering is love in that point, in that position. That's a hard pill to swallow because it sucks. Losing 3 babies sucks. Like Job losing his family here sucks. But he also came out of it, developed righteous, and he is one of those patriarchal figures that everybody looks up to in the Bible. Like he is the epitome of righteous. If that's our goal, is being righteous, then suffering would still be loving, in my opinion.
And also, death is not the end. For God, death is not the end. This time that we have on earth is very, very short in comparison to the eternity that we have with him. And there will be more to explore that in the second part of your question, buddy, because that is also an important thing to address. But the point is that this time of life is, no matter how long you live, short. It's very short. So the question that you have to ask is even though as short as it is does it mean something? Does all of the suffering and all of the good mean something? And legitimately, buddy, I want to ask you that question. Do you believe that your life and all the good that happens to you and also your suffering means something? Because that's really the only two directions we have. Either life means something, therefore all the things that happen in it, good and bad, have purpose, or it doesn't, and nothing that happens to you matters. If nothing that happens to you matters, why do you even want to ask this question? Why does it matter to you? Ultimately, you're raging against the infinite void that doesn't listen or care. You may perceive that as a great injustice, but is it? Is there such a thing as justice? Is there anything owed to you? No, you're a mistake. A long time ago, a lightning bolt struck a puddle and made a bunch of sludge, and in that sludge, a single-celled organism came out. Eventually, one single-celled organism swallowed another single-celled organism and made a slightly more complicated single-celled organism. Eventually, it was splitting and failed to split properly, and those failed to split cells learned to work together, and they made a bigger organism that's made up of multiple cells. And eventually that made its way to a monkey, which made a smarter monkey, which made a smarter monkey that could stand upright, which eventually somehow made its way to you. Why do you matter in this long chain of suffering and mutations and malformed monstrosities that didn't have a purpose to begin with? Why does any of this matter? For us, we have the answer. It does. And we don't always understand why, but we know that it does. But what do you say to that? Because it's a question we all have to struggle with. It's not as if once God stops existing, we don't care about that anymore, that suddenly all of our problems go away. This is the issue that the new atheism has had to face. They spend a long time harping on the problem of evil, but now they have to replace that with something. They have to replace God and an absence of meaning with meaning. But there's nothing there. We haven't seen a better world because there's lower church participation in these past few decades, with the new atheism's rise and a larger number of people leaving the church. We've seen a worse world because of it. So even if we want to look at the practical result, what do we see?
That's why, for us, we went through 3 different churches going through our miscarriages, and none of them were equipped to handle what we had been going through. None of the pastors knew what to say. There was no plan in place until I built it, because I said, this is unacceptable. If you do the math, 1 in 4 women experience infertility and infant loss and pregnancy loss in some way. That's a quarter of the women in the church of any age, like past, present, future. There needs to be attention on this, right? So I used my suffering to make sure that nobody else had to feel the way that I felt when I went through it, because there was a support system suddenly. Our job with suffering as Christians, or in your case, buddy, as a questioning maybe believer or non-believer, the job of suffering here is to take it and look out. Because if you look in at your own suffering constantly, you will fall apart. I did. I walked away from church. I walked away from God. I couldn't handle being in a place where people did not understand what I was going through and didn't know how to respond to it. I couldn't handle watching the worship singer cry every Sunday for no reason when I was dying on the inside. I could not handle it. And then the second that I motivated myself somehow, I don't even know, it was a God thing. Somehow I found the will to look out. And that was when God brought me all of these women and couples that Cody and I got to mentor and walk alongside for years. And it was because we looked out with our suffering instead of looking in. And we used it to make sure that nobody else had to suffer in that crippling way. There is power in suffering. There is redemption in suffering outside of what God can do for us, because we're made in his image and we have this authority and we can use it and turn it for good and for glory. And it's just so hard to do that. But once you get to that point, I can look up and I can say, God, thank you for taking care of those children for me, because now your children get to convict my heart and I get to make sure that they know how you feel about them. I have angel babies because I had babies pass away. But God has angel babies that are lost, that need him and need people to help them find him.
Yeah. Made me think of the depth of this question, like it just doesn't start with good versus evil. Like one of the first things that I think I had to answer to kind of get past this question is the view on, to me, this is also brings into free will versus determinism. That was one of the main struggles for me for a while, is how could a good God allow suffering in a deterministic world? And if that's the position you're coming from for this question, then I understand the struggle there, because in a deterministic worldview, there is no way that you can remove God from causing direct evil. God causes every miscarriage. God actively causes. He's the one willing that into existence, saying that needs to happen in a deterministic worldview. And that was a hard thing to mentally get over. But once you get into the free will framework and I won't say covenantal, but God can do whatever he wants, but he also has made promises of not getting involved further in certain areas. Like we know that he won't flood the entire world again, because that is a promise that he's made. If there's any other promises that we haven't seen where he is limiting his involvement for any specific reason, and maybe you guys can help me articulate that better, but it seems like it's not just this, God sees bad things happening, he could stop them, he doesn't. It seems like there is also a free will and a promise God has made throughout the thread of life as well, where because of our free will, we've also caused certain sufferings on ourselves that are beyond God. Not beyond God, that's probably the wrong term, but
he didn't force on you.
Correct.
I think that actually lends pretty well to the second part of Buddy's question. I do apologize, this is a lot, but we warned you there's going to be a lot involved in answering this question. And to be fair, it is a very complicated question, and it's a beautiful question.
It deserves the time that it's being given and more. Like, I wish that we could expound on this forever, but it's a universal question that deserves the time.
Absolutely. So the second part of Buddy's question that I think we need to address independently here is, imagine if you had children knowing they will never be good enough to sit in your house. I'd say you are a horrible person. And when those children fall short, as they are guaranteed to do, they deserve eternal death. It doesn't seem like there's any love from God. Why even create us if we are literally built to fail? So what Cody was saying earlier kind of goes into this. It's not that we're built to fail, it's that we're built with free will. Now, yes, God is at the end of all of that. He knows the end result because he's outside of time, as you said, Buddy. But the question there is, what does that mean? He's outside of time. We don't fully understand it because we're human. But the best stab at it that I can get, and that other people like C.S. Lewis have hinted at, God experiences all time as the present. I'm observing two people right now in the present. Am I determining what they're doing? No, I'm looking at it. I can involve myself with the two of them. I can interact with them, and in that way shape what they're doing because I'm interacting with them, whereas before I wasn't. But I'm not controlling them. Now, God is more powerful than me. He has more influence over the physical world and also over people. We've seen that there are times where he does actually force people to take certain actions. That's undeniable. What's also undeniable is that he gives people choices, and he honors their choices, and this happens just as often as he controls results. An example of this is King Hezekiah with Isaiah. Isaiah tells Hezekiah he is going to die. God has willed his death, and Hezekiah asks for mercy. And so because Hezekiah wants mercy and wants to live longer, God gives him an additional 15 years of life. But because of Hezekiah's request, Israel is ultimately put in danger and is put in the eyes of Babylon and is conquered, because Hezekiah does some really stupid stuff. But my favorite example is in Esther, where Mordecai tells Esther, God will save the Jews even if you don't help, but you and your family will die, and who knows but that you were put here for this exact purpose. She didn't have a choice in getting to that place. God brought her there. She did have a choice in what she did at that point. Both are true. God influences your life, but he gives you a choice. And so I do genuinely believe all of life is building you to an ultimate choice. Are you going to give your life to God? What he has given to you, are you going to give it back, or are you going to keep it for yourself? Now, yes, God ultimately does know that choice because he currently is at the end of that choice, but all of your choices are the present for him. And just as like I said, I am observing presently what two people are doing right now, God is presently observing your entire life. Every single minute of it, as you presently are observing it, but he observes it in its entirety where you observe it moment by moment. But still, I think there's more to that question that deserves to be teased out. Simply knowing something and knowing that something bad will happen, does that mean that you are responsible for it? Seemingly that does make sense. Because I agree with you. If you gave birth to children knowing that you would never love them or they would never be good enough for you, that would be terrible. And I use that argument for Calvinism too. If God specifically forces his children, he predetermined which children he's going to hate and which children he's going to love, that sounds kind of messed up. But again, setting aside the extreme example for a second, every single parent on earth knows the child they're giving birth to will die. Are they responsible for the deaths of their children? And that's a legitimate question I'm asking you, buddy, and I'm asking all of our listeners to really think about that. If you are a parent and you have a child, you know you are bringing that child into a world full of suffering and guaranteed death. What you can't guarantee is happiness. You can't guarantee a good life. No one can. And while today we have a greater measure of comfort than we once did, 400 years ago, you were bringing a child in to a family that was earning the equivalent of $1 a day. If you weren't a part of the very small, very, very small percent of people who were nobles and had access to wealth and the potential for education and a good life, you were almost guaranteed a horrible life. The life expectancy of a medieval peasant in Europe during the 1600s was about 35 years. It fluctuated. But that was largely due to infant mortality. And also, in the first few years of a child's life, there was an enormous amount of risk and a large number of problems that caused large numbers of children to be killed. Were those parents responsible for that because they knew there was a much better than not chance their children were going to die? And even if they didn't die, the best they could hope for was to live a very, very hard life and die sometime in your 30s. Were they responsible for that? Was it evil for them to have children? And there was actually very recently in the news a guy who's a mortalist who bombed a fertility clinic because that was his position. He believed that it was wrong for people to have more children because if you have children, you are knowingly bringing a child into the world that, one, can't consent to life. We don't get a say in this. And two, is guaranteed to die. So what's the point of having kids? And once again, if you take God out of it, I honestly couldn't tell you. The scientific reason for why we have kids is because if we didn't, we wouldn't be here. In fact, that is literally the only explanation for anything that happens to us. Why do we have two eyes? Well, if we didn't, we wouldn't be as good at surviving, and we wouldn't be here. Why do we have emotions? Well, they evolved because it made it more efficient for us for surviving, and if we didn't have them, we wouldn't be here. That's the only actual answer that science can give you in a world without God. It exists because if it didn't exist, you wouldn't exist. But why does it matter that you exist? It doesn't. You just do. And one day you won't. Morbid, I know. But that's the reality of a world without God. So once again, are you responsible for your children's death because you have children? I would say no. And most people would say no. Obviously not. But why does it matter then? Why is it important for us to have children and bring more life into a world where death is the only guarantee?
Because it's beautiful.
It is. As I asked in the first question, are there things that are beautiful for their own sake? Are the virtues worth living and dying for? Life is the first gift that we are given, and it's one of the most beautiful gifts because with it is infinite potential. But potential for what? Potential for those infinitely beautiful things. Potential for love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The virtues. Even a little bit of exposure to that, even a life full of suffering, punctuated by moments of virtue, is a life worth living. And that's always been the position. But is it right?
I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm reading into it too much, but I feel like this question comes from a place of suffering. And I just want to acknowledge whatever you've been through, buddy. Because, I sense that in your question, that there's just this underlying thing or things that have happened that have caused you to really reconsider or doubt if you can trust God. And I think that is the root of this question. Can I trust God? Can I trust that my life is going to be manageable? And sometimes the answer is going to be no. There is no guarantee that you're going to get everything that you want. There is no guarantee that people are going to love you. There is no guarantee that you won't get sick or someone you love won't get sick. There is no guarantee that your children are going to be okay. There is no guarantee that you will have wealth.
No, Ben was talking about in the 1700s how they were making $1 a day. I'd go for that about right now.
No, but there's no guarantee. As a Christian or as a non-Christian, there is no guarantee that you are going to have a good life. Like, we are guaranteed a couple of things in the Bible, which is eternity or hell, like it's an and that's really it. So like, if you take the time to think this question through and what motivates it, it's being that child who is sitting in the corner because other people made them, wondering who is going to let them out. Like, who loves me and sees me enough, who values me enough to get me out of here. Like, we're in the corner right now and we've been put there by other people, and God is going to be the one to sweep in. Jesus is the one who swept in and pulled us out and told us that there will be no more weeping, but we're not going to get it here.
And I think that's, how I said this is very multifaceted. Like, he mentions how Buddy mentioned, why create if it's just for failure? And like, through scripture, we know that God had a plan for that. It wasn't that we are just doomed to fail. We will fall short, but he also gave us a route out of that failure, a route to sit in his presence again. It's not that we're not invited into his house. There is a route through Jesus now. Like, there always has been. Like, we've always had that option to come out of our mistakes into God's presence through Jesus. Like, that was once for all.
I had a dream that I was standing outside of these huge wooden doors, and there was like somebody outside that told me I had to knock if I wanted to go in. And it's a stupid analogy, but this is literally the dream that I had. And so I knocked on the door, and the door opened, and then I had to walk in. And when I walked in, I was in God's throne room, and you would think that any normal human being would fall to their knees and worship God on the spot. That's how the Bible makes it sound, that every knee will bow and declare the name of the Lord. I didn't do that. I stomped my foot and I demanded something from God, and it was silly of me. But instead of striking me down with a lightning bolt, he laughed at me like I was his precious little child. And I know that we don't all get that type of dream, but I treasure that because, one, I had to take the step of knocking to go inside. And then when I still acted stupid after I got in, God did not shun me or punish me. He loved me. And we are all able to access that. We all are sinners, regardless of what type of sin. We all are sinners. And he still loves us that way. So do we suffer? Yes. But we look up, we make the step to go in to him, and he loves us and he has affection for us. And it's not going to change the fact that this life is painful, but he's there. So.
Yeah, one of the things that has helped me with these questions is also, what is the alternative? Like, what is the alternative? If not God, if God is not good, if God is not loving, what is the alternative to these questions? And Ben's been harping at that his entire conversation, but the reality of a world that has this alternative view rather than God is good is a world where, murder is merciful, death is a good thing. That would be the end to suffering. Like, if that is the alternative, then it is not that can't be the alternative. Like I do think there is a sense of suffering and evil that points to God, because the alternative of that suffering and evil is monotony and pointless and not what we would exemplify as good, even in a atheistic viewpoint. And that is what Ben was saying when the new atheists are having to deal with this alternative, and there isn't one. Like the only option is a good God at the end of the day. It's just where you're at with the alternatives. And you have to ask the alternative question. You can't just say, well, this doesn't seem loving to me, so there must not be a good God. What is the alternative to that?
We have this big canvas hanging on our wall, and it's got names on it of people that we have met over the years that have experienced very high levels of suffering. There's, representations on this canvas of people who are homeless, people who aged out of foster care, and there was nobody to teach them how to be an adult, and they are literally losing their mind on the streets because they don't have anybody to talk to. There are foster children. There is a name of a child who lost both parents to domestic violence. There is a homeless man's name who lost his daughter at a very young age, and he couldn't cope, and he got addicted to drugs and went and lived on the streets. There's the name of a mom who is pregnant and is addicted to drugs. There are so many different types of suffering all around us. And we just happened to stop and get their names. And there was nothing we could do to make it better. Like, please hear this and go and be a comfort to somebody, even if you're suffering. Like, it is so universal, and it is so painful that some people can't bear it. And we need to bear each other's burdens. That's my preference in thinking about this question is there's nothing I can do to stop it. I'm helpless, but I can go love people.
There's one more part to this question that I think does need to be addressed directly. It's been kind of addressed indirectly, but it's Buddy's point. Why even create us if we're built to fail? Why even create us if some of us are going to end up in hell? Why bother even making those people? At least that's the way I am interpreting that part of the question. Cody had talked a bit about free will earlier, and it sucks to keep saying, yeah, free will. But that's largely what it is. If you give people the power to choose, but then you intentionally only make people who will choose you, have you really created a world full of free choice, of free will? No. It's like if I create a casino and I say everyone has an equal chance to win, but only exclusively my friends win. Am I being honest? No. The unfortunate reality, kind of going back to the virtues, there are certain virtues that require people to fail. And it's not that God forces it. It's that is a result of free will, of choice. And because of free will, because of choice, virtues that could not be expressed any other way are able to be used. Mercy is beautiful. That's why there are songs about mercy and grace and forgiveness. That's why Corrie ten Boom's story is so impactful, where she forgives one of the men who ran her concentration camp, who was horrendous and evil, a Nazi. Forgiving someone like that changed that man's life and changed her. That's the power of those virtues that are impossible in a world where there isn't failure. But that's the problem. In order for us to have those highest of virtues, we need to have the worst of failure. Like Cody said before, you train, and the level of your training dictates your strength. The level of suffering that you incur on yourself in training largely dictates how strong you are going to be. And we recognize that there are certain things that are beautiful and worth it for their own sake. These virtues are worthy of existing for their own sake, and yet they require people to choose the wrong thing. Again, it's not that God forces that to happen. It's that He's made a world where people can choose the wrong thing. And you're not forced to choose the wrong thing, but because of the nature of free will, people will. And also because of that, in the end, there are people who will, at the end of all things, when confronted with the infinite goodness of God, choose to reject Him. And it's not that God forces them to, it's that they will make that decision. The essential part of free will is that there is something in you that is non-causal. I know that's kind of complicated and weird and very deeply philosophical, but effectively it means that God didn't force it to be. He gave it to you. It came into existence when you did, and God took his hands off of it and said, that is yours. Give it back to me or keep it for yourself. And at the end of all things, that is what we will all do. Choose to give that bit of ourself that we have that's ours, that we're king over, that we govern, and is really the only thing that is ours. Will we give that to God, or will we keep that for ourselves? And it does stink. It is awful. There are so many people who will not choose God in the end. But there is hope. We see throughout the entirety of the Old Testament and the New Testament that God is constantly rebuilding this idea of hope, that for the hopeless, for the people who don't seem to have any way out, he will go to any lengths to ensure that every possibility is extended to them, that for the lost souls in the flood and Sheol, they were given a chance. The worst people imaginable, so terrible that they needed to be wiped out in a global flood, there's still hope for them, that God died even for them. So there is still hope. There's not a lack of hope until the very end.
Buddy, you are precious, and we are praying for you. And we are thankful that you are brave and bold to ask this question, because all of us think it constantly. There are moments where I just sit back and I'm like, holy crap, this is bad. God, why aren't you stopping this? Like, it's a constant wrestling.
Oh, and like, that's what all this talk is good. And like, this is how we mentally process this. But for me, this is still not even satisfactory to me. So like, you at the beginning of your question, you said that you've not been satisfied with the answers, and you're not alone. I'm not either.
Well, and I know I've talked a lot. Like, I've talked an enormous amount in this question, and yet I am also not fully satisfied with any of this. The only time I've ever been satisfied is not with thought, but with feeling. When I felt the presence and goodness of God, in those very brief fleeting moments where that's been possible for me. And in those moments, I felt peace. It's called in the Bible, the peace that surpasses understanding. The only way you will have satisfaction in moving forward without having these questions fully answered is to know the goodness of God. And that's what I pray for you, buddy, legitimately, because I think all of us here has at one time or another experienced the goodness of God. And the only way you can find true satisfaction in this life and in the life after is to know his goodness personally, in a way that you can't reason through. Reason will get you to the door. But as Gina did, you have to knock, and he has to let you in.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.